We will start with some opening words from Thorsten, who is one of the working group leads from Working Group 3 and from the SuSanA Working Group 3, and he will also say a few words just now. Then we will have an introduction to the topic and the launch of the study, which is the main point of this session today, by Katrin Brübach and Arne Panesar. And after that, we will have our colleagues from AguaConsult presenting the study and the main points and discussions of the study. And we'll have a few minutes for some question and answers. So if you have questions to the study directly, please post them in the chat and we will try to still answer them. If you have questions that go beyond, please also already post them in the chat whenever they come up, and we'll try to incorporate them in the following panel discussion. So regarding the panel discussion, we have 5 panelists with us later today. One of them, Martin Gambrill, the lead water and sanitation specialist in the World Bank's Water Global Practice. We have John Matthews, executive director and co-founder of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. We have Katrin Brübach, Global Director, Programs, Innovation and Impact of the Resilient Cities Network. We have Arne Panesar, Head of the GIZ Sector Program Sustainable Sanitation, that also hosts the Secretariat of the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance. And we have Kate Medlicott, Team Leader, Sanitation and Wastewater in the Water Sanitation, Hygiene and Health Unit of the WHO. So thank you already from my side for joining today's session, and I would now hand over to Thorsten to give us some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Mintje, and thank you for the opportunity today to open the online session on a new study on climate resilient urban sanitation, published by the Resilient City Network and the Sustainable Sanitation Alliance, and the study has been prepared by AguaConsult UK. Why is the topic on climate resilient urban sanitation so important? While climate generally is very high on the global agenda, climate resilience of sanitation system is still widely overlooked. Not considering the potential of sanitation systems contributes to 3 important international agreements: the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. But to make sanitation systems more climate resilient, it's necessary to develop new modes of cooperation. It's necessary to improve cross-sectoral and cross-thematic cooperation. But how can sanitation sector contribute to climate resilience? I would like to give some examples to make it more tangible. First, by improving its energy efficiency and through generation of renewable energies, the sanitation sector has potential to contribute substantially to decarbonization. Second, sanitation systems need to be protected against more frequent and destructive flood events, which are climate change related. Climate change may also limit water availability, which will require to adapt sanitation systems. Otherwise, they will fail or not fulfill their purpose and protecting human health and the environment. Climate change will additionally increase the pressure on the sanitation sector to make systems more sustainable through recycling of nutrients and organic matter, as well as the protection of scarce water resources. This has been just a few examples how a sanitation system can contribute to more climate resilient cities. The publication presented today is an important first step in analyzing climate risks and opportunities of urban sanitation systems. It also suggests how climate resilient issues can be systematically addressed in the sanitation sector. I wish all of you an exciting online session with many new insights. Thank you very much. And with this, I would like to hand over to Katrin and Arne for the introduction part. Thank you.
So our mics are unmuted, Katrin, and we are visible. And now we're waiting for the slide. Okay, here we go. Launch of the study. And now, 1, 2, 3. The Climate Resilient Urban Sanitation Study is launched.
And I totally messed it up. I'm sorry.
It's perfect. Okay, this was a virtual launch. Now, everybody, welcome here to our launch show. You can, thanks for all the clapping. You can, with your mouse, if you're on a computer with your mouse, you can go over the tiny links and download it immediately so you won't need to listen to us. But it will as well be posted in the chat so you have any time to look at it. It's about 4 years back, where as a sector program at GIZ, we were discussing with the ministry about the current phase. And climate resilient urban sanitation was something that we saw coming, and we got the task to work a little bit in that direction. And I'm very happy that the ministry gave us this task to bring some knowledge together along these lines. And it was 2 years ago that we met Katrin at the Stockholm Water Week and said that the cities network and the sector program of GIZ would be great partners to do so. And we got excited. We had an event about sinking cities and lost investments, and looked into the broader resilience aspect of things. And I'm as well very happy that we found AguaConsult, who I think did a great job. And here we are. And I think these are my few opening sentences. And Katrin, please add to these.
So I guess there's not that much to add from our side, just to say it has been an honor and a pleasure as a city network, and so to say a non-sanitation organization, or like not that sanitation focused organization, to participate and to be the proud and selected partner of GIZ and the sanitation, sustainable sanitation program specific to work on this study, to reflect on what cities need, and to reflect on why urban sanitation in the context of urban resilience is such an important aspect. And I think we have, over the last 2 years, we tried to figure out, is it important, is it not important? I think we came to the conclusion it is important. The response of our cities was incredibly positive. They are very, very interested, and I guess when COVID started, and looking at what we all went through over the last 1.5 years, it becomes even more important and more pronounced how important sanitation is, not only for our own resilience, but also for cities and for the world. And I'm very happy, and I'm very glad, and I'm very proud to be next to Arne and his team to launch the study today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for these introductory words. With that, I would like to directly hand over to AguaConsult to tell us a bit more about the study. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Minchi. And thank you to everyone at GIZ and RCN at Resilient Cities Network. It's been an exciting journey over the past few months working on this, and glad we're here. So if I can go to the next slide, please. I'd like to start by introducing our team. So there's myself, George Michael, and also with me today is Leonie Hyde-Smith from the University of Leeds, and Bill Twyman. Also, folks that have worked on the report but are not presenting today are Elise Jabaji, Delia Sanchez-Trancon, and Emily Bamford, who've all contributed quite a lot to this study. If you can go to the next slide, please. When we talk about urban resilience, we are often referring to the capacity of urban systems to survive, to adapt, and grow in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks. What is often overlooked, as Thorsten mentioned earlier, is sanitation. one of the key frameworks that, again, Thorsten mentioned, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, talks about promoting the resilience of critical infrastructure, including water, transport, telecommunications, but sanitation is not mentioned there. And sanitation is a core function of a city. It can be an Achilles heel of a city. Can we go to the next slide, please? And just so we're on the same page in terms of what we mean by a sanitation system, it's discussed quite often, but just to reiterate, we're talking about the infrastructure and services that you typically see in terms of collection, transport, treatment, disposal, and reuse, but we're also talking about the enabling environment, the institutions that are there, the monitoring, financing, everything around it that makes the infrastructure and services operate appropriately and safely. Can we go to the next slide, please? So when we're looking at the resilience of urban sanitation systems, we looked mainly at the direct impact from climate-related shocks and stresses. There are other shocks and stresses like political, economic, whatever those are, pandemics, but right now we're mainly focused on the direct climate-related shocks and stresses. And those are 4: extreme heat, water scarcity and drought, increased precipitation, flooding, and extreme weather, and rising sea levels. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all of the impacts. We looked at different studies, and the impacts have already been mentioned. But what we would focus on is that a lot of the studies have focused on the impact on infrastructure directly and services, less so on the enabling environment. So there's a discussion of how water scarcity impacts sewers and it leads to collapse. There's an understanding of how flooding and rising seawater impacts wastewater treatment facilities, but less so studies on how extreme heat can impact, can lead to heat stress of sanitation workers, how flooding can increase the financial impact on households whose on-site sanitation systems are flooded with groundwater or surface water. Next slide, please. And I think I'm handing over to my colleague, Bill.
Yeah, thank you very much, George, for that introduction. So for our study, we looked at 4 case study cities, which were Cape Town, Chennai, Lusaka, and Santa Cruz. Across these cities, what we see is that climate change is having varying impacts in general and also specifically on sanitation services. The impact of climatic changes has been much more pronounced in Chennai and Cape Town compared to Santa Cruz and Lusaka. Chennai has experienced severe flooding and extreme weather events, as well as considerable water scarcity challenges. Additionally, Cape Town experienced severe water scarcity challenges with what has been termed a 1 in 590 year drought from 2015 to 2018. Looking first at demand for climate resilient urban sanitation, we see that it is tangible impacts such as loss of life, economic shocks, or sustained requirements for behaviour change that play a critical role in creating demand for climate resilient services. This is most clearly seen in the large-scale flooding in Chennai and the water scarcity challenges in Chennai and Cape Town. In both these cities, we find that forecasts and assessments highlighted vulnerabilities. However, it was only after acute shocks that stakeholders took concerted action. And this is not just an issue of government, it's also development partners, civil society, households, for example. Additionally, while a wide range of measures are being taken across the 4 cities, we see that investments that are directly or indirectly strengthening the climate resilience of sanitation services are generally not being driven by an intentional desire to increase the climate resilience of sanitation services. Instead, what we found is that these measures are largely driven by a desire to ensure the delivery of reliable water supply services or to improve sanitation services more broadly. The core focus is not climate resilient sanitation at this point in time. Looking at adaptations to water scarcity and droughts, we see that adaptation responses to water scarcity and droughts mainly focus on ensuring the reliable provision of water supply services by diversifying, securing or enhancing water sources. These are indirectly strengthening the resilience of sanitation services. The diversification of water sources in Cape Town alongside a series of measures that reduce water consumption by 40%, is perhaps the best example that we found of this. Notable adaptations have nevertheless been made across the sanitation service chain to increase climate resilience. These include wastewater recycling in Chennai, where wastewater recycling has been made mandatory, decentralized wastewater treatment systems have been implemented, and recycled wastewater is sold to industries on a considerable scale. Additionally, a key finding from water scarcity challenges in Cape Town was that wastewater treatment plants with inherent flexibility were better able to withstand low flow conditions that occur under water scarcity rather than inflexible systems. And finally, looking at flooding and extreme weather events, we see that several adaptations have been implemented across the 4 cities, which directly increase resilience to flooding and other extreme weather events. For example, in Lusaka, on-site sanitation facilities have been modified to increase resilience to the recurrent floods that affect the city. Additionally, elsewhere we see that decentralized wastewater treatment systems increase flexibility by reducing dependencies on large centralized wastewater treatment plants that are often impacted by flooding. So damage to one or even several facilities during a flood should not catastrophically impact the other systems. Again, we also find that many broader activities that have not been driven or not been implemented by a core desire to increase the resilience of sanitation services are also reducing vulnerabilities to flooding and thereby indirectly strengthening the resilience of sanitation services. So this includes, for example, large stormwater management programs and flood monitoring and flood forecasting tools. I now hand over to my colleague Leonie to talk about some of the key gaps and opportunities in this area.
Thank you, Bill. So I will just name some of the key gaps and opportunities identified in the study. And that's independent of climate change and resilience aspects, there is a substantial gap in the level of financing available for achieving the 2030 sanitation targets. And adding now climate resilience to the mix will add additional costs, but there are so far no global estimates on what these additional costs will be. And here it's also important to take into account that there is no state of like total or 100% resilience. There will always be a trade-off between an acceptable residual risk and the costs of increasing sanitation resilience. So from an advocacy perspective, it is equally or might even be more important to understand the costs of doing nothing, both in terms of the economic costs, but also in terms of the extent that this would slow down or even regress the progress towards the SDGs. On the opportunity side, there are climate funds available that are currently thought to be underused for financing sanitation. And when looking into options of accessing additional financing for sanitation, it is also relevant, as Thorsten mentioned, to look at the potential of mitigation within resilience. Many of the paths to better sanitation resilience, such as moving towards safely managed sanitation or capturing value from waste or implementing nature-based solutions, are also contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from sanitation systems. And next slide, please. So this is the proposed framework that describes what climate resilience means for urban sanitation. And this framework is structured based on the structure of the City Water Resilience Framework with 4 dimensions and then subordinated, connected and overlapping goals. And while it is tailored to sanitation, it reflects the interconnectivity and the interdependence of urban infrastructure, governance and service systems. And it is important that there is no prescription of a specific service approach or technology choice, but it recognizes the difference in context and recommends to adopt an outcome-based lens. I will quickly unpack some selected goals and key ideas in this framework. Next slide, please. So for example, if we look at the dimension of leadership and strategy, we can zoom into that goal of coordinated governance. Coordinated governance that describes the need for overcoming the challenge of fragmentation and poorly defined roles in the urban sanitation sector and governance systems. urban services are interlinked, and therefore there's a need for intersectoral coordination, multi-stakeholder partnerships, and a citywide approach to resilience and sanitation service provision. This also includes formalizing services and integrating on-site sanitation services into the service framework. And that's needed then to facilitate the coordination and the preparedness for and during extreme weather events. Next slide, please. So when looking at the dimension of planning and finance, urban sanitation regulation can be an enabler or a hindrance for improved climate resilience. Well-targeted and enforced regulation can protect sanitation users from inadequate infrastructure quality, as well as the neglect of operation and maintenance that then leads to sanitation systems or parts of them to become ineffective or fail during climate-related shocks. Users also need to be protected from indirect consequences of extreme events, such as opportunistic overcharging for repair and maintenance. And there an example would be overcharging for pit emptying after a flooding event. But it's also important to identify regulatory obstacles for resilient solutions, such as like innovative service and technology approaches that might currently not be covered by the regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So in terms of the dimension of infrastructure and service provision, we can look at effective asset management, and that requires good data availability, but often data on sanitation assets is weak, and that then hinders the preparedness and the opportunity to be proactive in the management of these assets. Routine or preventive maintenance and upgrading of sanitation infrastructure, and that's quite important. Also, the interconnected systems and services can prevent systems from failure during extreme events. But this requires adequately trained personnel and reliable supply chains. Next slide, please. Finally, in the dimension of health and environment, we wanted to zoom in on equitable service provision because it is really important to understand that despite the related costs of resilience, resilience cannot replace equity in the discussion. Climate change related hazards are likely to exacerbate inequalities of basic service provisions, and therefore climate resilient sanitation planning and urban resilient planning in general needs to actively take steps to realizing more equal services. So the idea of just bouncing back is not enough. And again, this cannot be achieved within a WASH silo, but requires a strong cooperation with other sectors, such as housing, for example. And with that, I'm handing back to George.
Thank you, Leonie. I'd like to propose we leave with 3 categories of takeaways because I struggle to make it 3 simple points. The first is, why is climate resilient urban sanitation important? And why is resilience within urban sanitation important? And that's because without it, climate change will exacerbate the current inequalities that we already see. Any progress that has been made is likely to be lost. But also, as Leonie mentioned earlier, it's important to quantify what a do-nothing scenario is and what it costs not to invest in resilience in the current sanitation systems. Second, there's no endpoint, there's no blueprint for climate resilient urban sanitation. Resilience in general is referred to as an end state. It's not an end state, it is a journey. And that includes things like integration. When you're looking at integration of sanitation with drainage, with solid waste, it's a continually evolving process. There's no clear endpoint to it. You constantly have to work on it. And the last thing is around planning and putting resilience at the core of planning. And that's putting resilience at the core of sanitation planning, whether you're working on citywide inclusive sanitation or anything, or strategies, or you're working on city planning. Resilience being at the core of this will help integrate the different infrastructure and services and the enabling environment more effectively. And as we mentioned earlier, looking at just adapting sanitation infrastructure is not enough. It's important to look at the capacity of sanitation service providers, businesses, utilities, municipalities, regulation. Everything around the infrastructure and services is also critical to look at. And finally, mitigation, something Thorsten talked about earlier. We believe mitigation is a key and non-negotiable co-benefit when you're building resilience. Looking at climate change, it's not just about resilience to climate change, but also mitigating climate change. And with that, we end the presentation. And just before we open to question and discussion, again, I'd like to thank GIZ and RCN, which have been really critical for kind of pushing us forward on this. Also the cities and the external reviewers that gave us a lot of their times, were very generous with their times and gives a lot of really good feedback on the study. Then we have about now 15 minutes of Q&A. 15 or 5? 15. 5 minutes, sorry.
We have 5 minutes, yes. So if anyone has a specific question to the authors of the study, please post them in the chat. Okay, there's a long question in the chat for you, George. I can read it for you. There are so many programs for sanitation since 2000 under MDG and now continue to SDG till 2030. But the classical issue in the developing country is financially supporting. How the current situation when the COVID pandemic come as the global situation and the supporting financial for sanitation become reduced. How do you think in term to improve sanitation for the next 5 years due to the COVID situation, especially in the development countries such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam?
Can we just answer one at a time, Minchi? Is that okay?
That's currently, I think there's a second question, but yeah, you can go with this one.
I think we haven't, I guess, looked at the immediate, because we as AguaConsult, we also work with a lot of urban sanitation and hygiene businesses, and we understand there's an immediate need because of COVID, and I think that isn't necessarily what we're looking at here. In terms of the more medium to long term, the suggestion mentioned by Leonie is there are a lot of climate funding for resilience and adaptation, as well as mitigation, and that has been a challenge to unlock, and that's something that is quite important to focus on and invest in to better understand how to unlock that funding, which is quite significant funding, increasing regularly, often.
Okay, thank you, George. There are a couple of questions now, but I would like to take some of them also into the panel discussion, but there's one specifically. Could you please elaborate on climate change mitigation through sanitation?
Yeah, there have been, and I think there are more studies on the emissions from sanitation, whether it's from pit latrines, septic tanks, wastewater treatment facilities, the amount of CO2. I think, I'm sorry if I don't remember the numbers, maybe I shouldn't say it. Sanitation does contribute to climate change in terms of methane and CO2 emissions. I don't remember the percentage, I remember something around 3%. And working towards capturing biogas and using it for energy and things like that should be considered as part of building the resilience of sanitation infrastructure and systems.
Okay, thank you, George. There is another question. In making mitigation non-negotiable, is there a risk of a bias towards options, technologies that don't make sense from other points of view? For example, financial sustainability, maintenance issues, etc.
Yes, there's always a risk of new and innovative technology going down a route that doesn't lead you to something that's financially viable. We see that quite often in sanitation systems and infrastructure. That doesn't mean we shouldn't test and invest in looking at mitigating emissions from sanitation. But there is a risk with innovation, as always, yes.
Okay, and I will take this one as the last question to you, George, and then I would like to take the other questions into the panel discussion. Have you suggested or recommended any tools to estimate the scenarios from different measures in water or wastewater treatment regarding emissions and emission reduction?
Well, I think that's for you, Minchi.
The question is in the report. If you have suggested or recommended any tools in the report.
We have talked about ECAM, which is a tool that GIZ developed on, I think, the emissions from utilities and how utilities can measure their emissions. So yes, there are some suggestions in the report of tools to consider.
Okay, thank you, George. I mean, you can also look at the chat. There are lots of questions coming in now, but a lot of them are also, I think, going beyond what we were able to do in the study. So I'm happy that we have a panel now of 5 experts that we invited with their different views and their different approaches to contribute to this discussion. So I would like to ask Katrin and Arne and Kate and Martin and John to put your cameras on, please. And I have an opening question to each of you to start this panel discussion, and then I will take questions from the audience in. So the first question goes to you, Arne. Why do you believe talking about climate resilience in the context of sanitation and developing tools is important for GIZ and the German Development Cooperation? Your microphone is on mute.
Yes, thanks, Mintje, and thanks again to AguaConsult and the reviewers. I'm very happy about the result and what I heard. Well, Germany is one of the biggest donors as well in water and sanitation with, I think, 600 million every year. So I'm really happy, as I said in the opening, that the ministry asked us to look into that topic. And as we learned just now as well, you won't solve it without sanitation. And I think it's our role as a sector program as well to bring this message now with a better background knowledge to the bilateral programs and as well discuss it with the ministry. What are the next steps? So I'm very happy about that. And I think here is a responsibility and a role from the German side and as well from GIZ.
Okay, thank you, Arne, for this first answer. The next question I would like to pose to Kate. The WHO is championing sanitation safety planning. What were the drivers for you to integrate climate considerations into the sanitation safety planning risk-based management tool? And how do you see the need and response for such considerations in cities?
Thank you. Yeah, so I think for the last around 10 years, we've been looking at climate impacts on water and sanitation services, initially looking more at drinking water, but across all of our guidance, we're always looking at risk-based approaches. And so through that work, we've really been exploring how do we tackle climate change within that paradigm. And what's become really clear is that we need to integrate climate risks as we do with any other kind of risks that fall upon water and sanitation systems. So to that extent, we have integrated climate risk assessment as part of the Sanitation Safety Planning Manual, which will be released in its 2nd edition later this year. And then when it comes, so that's SSP is really a local level tool, and then at this more national policy regulatory planning, there's some information in our sanitation and health guidelines, and we're taking that forward through our regulators network. But I think actually we're at the early stage of all of this. I think we've got quite a lot to learn as a sector about how to do this well and how to integrate it into all of our tools. And I think just in terms of the needs and response, I won't go on much longer, but we also put out this year the State of the World Sanitation Report. And within that, I mean, it's really clear we've got a huge job ahead of us. We need to quadruple rates of progress on safely managed sanitation. We need $105 billion worth of investment, and we're in a backdrop of widening inequalities. So clearly, with the risks that climate change poses to sustainability of sanitation systems, we really need to be thinking about future-proofing our approaches so that investment is put to good use. I'll stop there, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. That was perfect. Katrin, the next question goes to you. The Resilient Cities Network has been working with 100 cities worldwide on strengthening their resilience. Is sanitation a priority for them in the context of building resilience? And why is the city network digging deeper into this topic?
Thank you so much. So, looking at initial statistics, so which I guess everybody likes to hear. So, about 25% of our cities say that sanitation is a potential risk for them in building urban resilience. Interestingly enough, only 25 say that, because if you start to dig deeper and look into the resilience strategies of the 82 that released them, it actually shows that sanitation is much more pronounced when we are looking at initiatives cities are planning. But the issue is they are not considered as traditional sanitation initiatives. So we are looking at sanitation solutions in the context of pollution, major issue. So then it's not a sanitation problem, it's a pollution problem, and cities are working around that. So I think that sanitation is a critical urban system. We are seeing that in the global south, that a lot of people, and Kate just mentioned it, are still facing, we're still facing a sanitation crisis, which is a stress cities are facing every single day. Looking at building urban resilience, this stress is recognized. Shock events exacerbate these stresses, like in unsafe sanitation, specifically in informal settlements, when pit latrines are overflowing and literally the shit is in the street. And I guess why are we looking at, and why do we have an interest in sanitation? Sanitation, or the sanitation system in the context of urban resilience, is a wonderful system to talk about resilience, because building resilience in a sanitation system, or building climate resilience in a sanitation system, means that you are able to leverage multiple co-benefits. And I think this is where I would like to challenge what Kate has been saying. This traditional kind of risk-based approach, we need to reduce risks and vulnerabilities. Yes, that's clearly a priority, and it's a priority for our cities. But we also need to think about how we can develop solutions that create opportunities. And the sanitation system, if we make sanitation systems more resilient against water-related shocks or stresses, or climate shock stresses, we also have this massive opportunity to address other vulnerabilities, like housing, like poverty, like public health, like resource recovery, like water scarcity. And I think this is what we need to acknowledge, is that we have been trying to solve a sanitation crisis for decades now, and we haven't literally made the progress we did. And the question for me is, why haven't we? So maybe we need to start looking at sanitation not only from a risk and a threat perspective, but from an opportunity perspective. And that is why I think the climate resilient conversation is so important, because climate change is a threat for us, but it also poses a lot of opportunities, or gives us opportunities to start thinking about solving sanitation and solving urban sanitation in a different way.
Thank you, Katrin. I will take up the question you posed back to Kate later. The next one, I would like to give the floor to Martin. The World Bank has recently published a guide on resilience with a resilience rating system. Further, there have been a number of water resilience publications in the recent years. Do you see the need to discuss sanitation separately in the context of the resilience conversation? And do you think we need separate tools and approaches for water and sanitation?
Thanks for the question. Thanks for inviting me to the event and for that question. And the quick answer is yes. The longer answer is at the World Bank, we've got a whole group army working on climate change, climate financing. And I'm actually going to do something now because I got your question in advance, and I have a response from. I'm doing this deliberately from one of my colleagues who's a senior climate change specialist, and I'm going to explain why I'm giving his response. The resilience rating system is now being piloted across the World Bank in selected IDA projects, so that's for low-income countries. Several of them are water projects, and which include sanitation components. While there are still many steps that would have to take place before the rating system application would become mandatory, i.e. there's a lot to learn in what it means to rate a project, we feel comfortable that the tools and guidance notes we've developed, if applied to project design, would warrant solid resilience ratings. In other words, the tools are designed to help structure thinking on water infrastructure design and investment master planning for resilience, including with respect to the sanitation chain. And the reason I mention his response is that I think what this report helps us do and what this issue helps us, we need to break down silos, and the report talks about that. And our climate change people, who I've been working with a lot recently, I lead our global initiative on citywide inclusive sanitation, don't understand sanitation, frankly, and we've been educating them on it. And we don't understand climate change necessarily in our sector, and they've been educating us about that. So and the reason I read out his response is because I'm working very closely with him and members of his team in moving this agenda forward concomitantly. And I think that's so important. And we've been educating so every World Bank project has to do GHG accounting now. Every single one of them, we have to do a GHG accounting, and we have GHG accounting tools to do that. But what we've seen is that when our GHG accounting specialists are looking at a sanitation project, they don't necessarily understand where all the leaks or all the climate impacts happen and the differences between networked and non-networked solutions, for example. So we've been, as it were, educating them as well as they've been educating us, and we're actually developing a GHG accounting tool for the urban sanitation service chain, irrespective of the type of service you have. So that, again, that's the reason I read out. I'm working very closely with them, and we're needing to educate each other, and I think this report will help us do that as well. We need to, and it talks about it, we need to bridge the gaps. We need to close the silos, and we need to bring them together. And I wanted to respond to a couple of quick things. What Katrin just said about the ongoing sanitation crisis, which has been there for years, and many of us have been working on for many years. I like this framing of it as an opportunity rather than a problem. And it's often a silent problem that we only pay attention to when there is a cholera outbreak or when something like that happens, rather than the ongoing silent emergency of morbidity and mortality and impact on quality of life. So I hope that this is an opportunity for us to do things differently in sanitation. And also, Kim Nace made a question in the comments about the positive light as well, and the link to environmental pollution. The final thing I'll say now is the following. What I also always say about sanitation is the beauty of sanitation is it touches on everything in development, but it's also the curse of sanitation is that it touches on everything in development, and that we sometimes fall between the gaps as a result of that. So I think these positive messages and how we can use this to induce appropriate investment in our sector is a great opportunity. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Martin. Talking about bridging the gap between climate and sanitation, I would like to ask our next expert, John, what is needed to strengthen the topic of sanitation in the climate discourse and to utilize the benefits of sanitation in the context of the Paris Agreement, in your view?
Thank you, Mintje. And I would just want to say I appreciate being involved and allowed to review. It's an excellent report, and I think you should be really proud of the report. Maybe another way to phrase your question is, why should people who work on urban sanitation and supply issues care about things like the Paris Agreement? And why are these high-level processes and policies important to us at a city level? I think that what we're seeing right now is actually a gigantic transition that's happening in terms of global climate discussions, that it's going from presidents and prime ministers to actually a much more even kind of bureaucratic and practical process, and that many of us are really going to be living with terms like NDCs and the Paris Agreement in our daily life. And why that's especially important at an urban level is most of the climate adaptation and mitigation decisions are not at a national level, they're at a city level. And that means that the work that the people who are on this call, that the people that are the audience for your report, they are actually at the center of the climate discussions for the next decade or more. They are making most of those climate decisions. And I want to echo that you know, some of the comments that were made earlier by Leonie and George, that topics like climate finance, like making sure that the decisions that we make at an urban landscape level around climate mitigation and climate adaptation, that they can scale up and can be reported and accounted for through national and international processes, are really critical. And that's one of the reasons why I feel really positively that the beginning of your report actually emphasizes this kind of climate narrative, the context in which we are starting to emerge. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see Minty at the moment. Let's see. Maybe we improvise until she's clearly back. And a point I'd like to make is what I was hearing is sort of, why didn't we call the whole report the sanitation opportunity? And that as well was in the chat. That what do we take from here? And I think it's a key element, and it could be the opportunity. Something that I'd really like to sort of as well to hear more from the panel is, I see sort of the question of toolification. We have limited capacities in the cities. We throw at them lots of tools, and the little capacity which is there is then doing PhDs on tools. I'm exaggerating here, but for me it's really a question. I think it's a fundamental topic and it's a fundamental opportunity. But what's a good way now to, we shouldn't have 20 tools and outside the sanitation sector nobody knows anything about it. We shouldn't have one tool per organization. But how do we approach this? I would be very happy to have reactions on that from the panel, and I would just like, now Minty is back, but if you allow me to have a reaction of Katrin, because you're working with the cities. Can you give a city perspective on tools and what could be a useful thing for cities?
So I guess cities like tools and solutions. So, and we are always asked, and we have this famous, so we have a WhatsApp group where like all our cities are posting questions and saying, I need this, I need this. And if you look at this chat, there's a lot about tools. I'm doing this, do you have a tool that can help me? So clearly there's a demand. The problem is that cities on a day-to-day basis, and specifically, let's say my counterparts, which are not sanitation department people, but resilience officers who literally look horizontally at the city and look at how can we strengthen urban resilience, they have multiple problems. And every single day from 8 to 5 or from 8 to 12, they are trying to sort multiple problems, and they need tools that allow them to assess risks and vulnerabilities, exactly what Kate has been highlighting, but then to use them to develop solutions that address multiple challenges. And if they find the jackpot, so to say, they get a tool which allows them to not only think about water but also sanitation. And I tell you, it's not a no-brainer that when you think about water resilience, you think about sanitation resilience. And I have been implementing the City Water Resilience Framework now for 2 years and have closely worked with the World Bank on all that. Sanitation falls through. So I think we need the tools, there's no question about it. We need to have integrated tools, and we need to have tools that nudge nudge cities to think holistically about their problems and not in a siloed way. And that means that exactly what we heard from Martin and from Kate and also from John is that we need to have people working together across disciplinaries and across city departments and thinking about what is our objective, what do we want to solve for, and how can we work together and do that. And I think the problem with all of us is that we tend to develop tools which are sanitation tools or water tools or climate tools or housing tools or God knows what kind of tools. But then the sanitation people talk to sanitation people, the water people talk to water people, nobody talks to cities anyway, and because it's like, and we see that mayors don't have anything to say, city people have nothing to say, and there's this lone person in the sanitation department who tries to sort out the sanitation crisis in a city of 30 million like Lagos. That's not going to work.
Back to you, Mintja.
Yes, thank you for taking over. And thanks, Katrin, for that answer. I would like to ask Kate to give a reaction to what Katrin also just mentioned, and also how we can move towards seeing sanitation in a more opportunistic way and not only risk-based.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And it's exactly kind of what the State of the World Sanitation Report called on. So it was basically saying, there's this really nice graphic I'd encourage you to look at in there that looks at kind of a business as usual scenario and an acceleration scenario, and basically asks the question, why are we leaving all these amazing opportunities on the table when it comes to cholera control, recurrent costs of the health services, housing, food safety, you name it, all of those we could, by getting ahead of the sanitation crisis, we can deliver opportunities into all of those other sectors. So I completely agree. The subtle distinction, I think, is when we talk about risk-based approaches, those are kind of management tools where you use risk assessment and management as a way of trying to understand where your problems are and where to invest. So they kind of are looking at two sides of the coin, I think. Just quickly on the tools, I also completely agree we need to align our tools and look for integrated approaches. But I would also say, I think it's probably unrealistic to imagine that we're going to have one perfect, fully integrated tool. That there's always going to be variations for slightly different uses or adaptations for a whole range of reasons. But I think we do need to be very careful as a global community that we're aligned on the scientific underpinnings of those things and the principles so that we're not sending conflicting messages, even if the tools themselves are subtly different in some cases.
Okay, great. Thank you for that answer, Kate. I would like to also hand Arne's question over to Martin, because I think it's an excellent question, how we are all aligning the different tools that everyone is now working on, sort of.
I think part of the challenge is many organizations have different modus operandi and different ways of interacting with what we call our government counterparts. We always work through governments, which is how it should be, but it also can slow things down considerably when you're preparing multi-million-dollar investment programs, rather than if you work for an NGO and you can do your own thing, as it were, on the side. So, of course, we need to work through governments. We have to work through governments. Our projects are government projects, they're not, and we fund them. And what I found from the last 3 years of working on this citywide inclusive sanitation initiative globally is what our project teams need, the World Bank project teams and their government counterparts. Yes, they need tools, but what they need is assistance to do things quickly. So don't just drop a tool on them, but come in and do it with them or for them, or bring in the TA and the funding to allow it to happen quickly. I think so. There are inevitably going to be different tools out there, and hopefully, sort of survival of the fittest will occur. But the tools need to come with discrete, explicit support to help our government counterparts, our city counterparts, implement them successfully and rapidly.
Great, thank you, Martin. I would like to go back to John as being one person here on the panel that is not working on a tool. I think you might have an interesting view on this as well from your point of view.
Thank you, Mintje. One of the things that I found that I really appreciated when I was going through your report was actually the emphasis on the city water resilience framework. It's an approach that we've been following for a number of years, and one of the reasons that we think that it's really useful is that especially as we're moving into this into a more dynamic climate, that we have new issues that are often unfamiliar to our partners, to to different parts of a city government or major stakeholders, is that the city water resilience framework is really a kind of meta tool. It helps us sequence and organize our tools. It sometimes reveals actually where there's some missing spaces that we need, that we can go send someone off on a PhD, maybe along Arne's line, to fill a specific gap. But in that sense, it's much broader than just one kind of do everything tool. It helps us organize and understand how resilience becomes a process that I think George in particular said very eloquently.
Thank you. Katrin, the last reaction for this round, and then I have a last question.
Thank you so much, John, for mentioning that. And I think, and Arne and I, we have not mentioned that. One reason why we started this tool or framework or conversation, let's call it conversation, is the recognition that the CWRF or the City Water Resilience Framework and the associated approach is very important, but sanitation tends to fall short in the conversation. And that is something what we are seeing, and we are currently implementing the approach in Addis and in Kigali. We see that sanitation falls somehow through this framework. And the idea here is to recognize that resilience of the water system is important, and the sanitation system is part of the water system, and we need to look deeper at the sanitation system. So whatever we have done in this study, and George and his team have vigorously looked at the CWA, because we have been part of the development of the CWA for 3 years, and we are using it in the network, and a number of our cities have applied it, that we actually strengthen that. So that we need to go deeper in sanitation, and we need to integrate it exactly in this holistic perspective around resilience. And I guess the World Bank was part of that. We all agree that it's important, but looking also at the chat, cities need to get ideas. So doing an assessment is one thing, but translating the results of this assessment into actual solutions is the next step. And that is about resilience planning. It's about integrated planning, and this is where cities need help, and they need us, and we need them, and I guess that's where we need to go.
Okay, thank you, Katrin, for this last remark, and thank you from my side to all the panelists, also for reviewing our study and for being part of this discussion and for joining our discussion today. My last question goes to Arne, and it's from the chat. What is the call for action? So what's next?
The sanitation opportunity. Let's talk about the sanitation opportunity, that this is a key issue that gets many things right. I think a number of speakers have underlined that. Let's continue the discussion in the SuSanA meeting and the Stockholm meetings in August, and take it from here to there. And I think I like as well that as organizations, we might have different needs for tools or ideas or processes, but have the underlying logic. Let's harmonize that logic and let's be in touch on that. And I think that would be a great way forward. And I think we are on the dot, more or less. So thank you everybody for your contributions, as well the peaking 130 people in the audience. Thanks for participating on the chat.
And also my sincerest apologies that we were not able to take more questions from the chat, but I think also our panelists were trying to respond to a few questions meanwhile, and I'm happy that a lot of people joined and that a lot of people are interested in this topic. And we will also share contact information with the presentation. So in case you would like to get in contact with us regarding this study specifically, and also you will have the names of the panelists that you can contact.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Have a nice night, day, morning, evening, wherever you are. Okay.